Welcome back to Theology Thursday, or welcome to Theology Thursday if this is your first one. Today I want to discuss the book of Ecclesiastes. It is an unusual and challenging book, without question, and there are some things that make it unique. Matter of fact, there are a number of things that make it unique and not like any other book in the Bible. So I want to share with you some of the uniquenesses of Ecclesiastes, and then I want to talk about the significance of the book and what I believe to be the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes. So let's talk about some of these uniquenesses. The book of Ecclesiastes has a heavy emphasis on worldliness. Eat, drink, and be merry because we're going to die tomorrow kind of mentality. There's a lot of pessimism or perceived pessimism. There's nothing good in life. There's nothing better to do. Everybody's going to die. You toil and labor for nothing, but someone else inherits it, that kind of thing. There's a really strange mixture of prose and poetry. Like there aren't poetic sections and prose sections. They're just all mixed together. Just be a verse dropped in. Just for example, I'll show you what I'm talking about. In chapter 1, it starts off with poetry, first 11 verses. Verses 12, 13, and 14 are prose. Verse 15 is poetry. 16 and 17 are prose, and verse 18 is poetry. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and there are a number of places you particularly see this, like chapter 5 and 6 are prose, chapter 7 is poetry, chapter 8 starts with poetry, shifts over to prose, chapter 9 is mostly prose, chapter 10 is poetry, chapter 11 begins with poetry, and then goes back to prose. Like there's just no consistency to it, so it's just kind of a strange mixture of both poetry and prose. The term preacher in the first couple of verses, then again in chapter 1, verse 12, 7:27, 12, 8 through 10. What's interesting is this is the only place in the Bible that this term occurs. Preacher. It is actually the word koheleth, and some Bibles actually call this book koheleth, and it just means someone who speaks to an assembly. That's why the King James translates it as preacher, and the English Standard Version does as well. That, by the way, is why the book is called Ecclesiastes. It comes from ecclesiastical, meaning having to do with the church. And so this is the preacher to the church was the way it was understood when the King James was translated. And so they called it Ecclesiastes, the church book, and the preacher is speaking to the church. So that kind of maybe helps you a little bit where it comes from. So get this description of Koheleth, the preacher. Another uniqueness of Ecclesiastes is the term vanity, which occurs 31 times in the book. In fact, it's called Vanity of Vanities, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then, under the sun. The phrase is used in Ecclesiastes 30 times and nowhere else in the Old Testament. So these are just some uniquenesses to Ecclesiastes, but I want to talk about the book itself and why I believe it's instructive. And I do take a little bit different view than most people and most scholars do when they approach the book. So Solomon is the traditional author. If there's anybody that could have authored it, it would have been Solomon. He had a chance to try everything. He had the money, he had the power, he had the position, the prestige, the intelligence. He lived during a time of great peace, so he had the time that would be afforded to do the book of Ecclesiastes. And I think the key to the book is found at the beginning and the very end. And I think that helps to comprehend what's going on in between. So the book starts with the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So the word vanity occurs 5 times. So I want to say 2 things about this. The word vain means to be a vapor. So it appears to have substance, like a fog, but you can't grab fog. There's no substance there. And so that's what a vanity is. It's a vapor. It's a fog. It has an appearance of substance, but there's nothing really there. But this phrase, vanity of vanities, in the Old Testament, something of something means it's the most. So if you want to say the holiest, you would say holy of holies. If you wanted to say the Lordest, like the ultimate supreme Lord, you would say Lord of Lords. The greatest king is King of Kings. So guys, if you want to score some points, call your wife the wife of wives. That means she's the greatest wife there has ever been. And so when it says vanity of vanities, All is vanity. What he's saying is, I have discovered the greatest emptiness that there is. The greatest fog bank of human existence. The greatest vapor that there is. Boy, all this looks like it has substance, but there's nothing there. So with that in mind, we'll look at the very end of the book and then talk about how I think these two statements help us to understand the book and help us understand the point, not just of Ecclesiastes, but in some ways the point of the entire Bible and what the author's driving at. So here's what he says at the end of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, starting in verse 9. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much steadiness is a weariness to the flesh. Now that verse is every seminary student's favorite verse. Of the making of books there is no end, and much study is weariness to the flesh. But here's what he says in the last two verses of Ecclesiastes. The end of the matter. Here's the conclusion of all this Proverbs, all this study, all this research, all that I've done. Here is the conclusion. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So he starts by saying vanity of vanities. He ends by saying, fear God and keep His commandments, because everything we've ever done is going to be brought out on Judgment Day. How are these two statements connected? Well, this is where I differ from what a lot of scholars have said about Ecclesiastes. I believe that the entire book of Ecclesiastes is what's called an inclusio. An inclusio is where you have a statement at the beginning and a statement at the end, and they're what matters. And then everything in between kind of fleshes that out. So this is what I believe. Solomon asked this question, and he wanted to research it. What if God did not exist? That's why 31 times we find the phrase under the sun. Solomon says, what if life consists only of what's under the sun? What if life consists only of this planet and the days that we have to breathe and to move? Should we pursue partying? And he talks about that in Ecclesiastes. Should we pursue wealth? Should we pursue gratification? He talks about women and pursuing women to somehow, some kind of self-gratification. Should we pursue wisdom and knowledge and accumulate as many degrees as we can, as much education as we can? How do you live life if God doesn't exist? And the conclusion that he comes to is life under the sun. Life with no God, life without God existing, is empty. It's vanity. Matter of fact, it's not just vanity, it is vanity of vanities. It is the ultimate vanity. And so he says, okay, if life under the sun, if life with no God, if life exists and that's all there is, the best you can hope for is to eat, drink, and be merry because we're going to die. That's pretty depressing. The whole book is intended to depress us. The whole book is intended to say, if all you live for is this life, you're living for a vapor, a vanity, a nothing. So then to the end of the book, after exploring all of this and thinking about it, interviewing people, researching it, trying some of this stuff in his own life, he says, okay, what is the conclusion I've come to? The conclusion I've come to is this. The best way to live life is not an under-the-sun perspective. It is an over-the-sun perspective. It's an above-the-sun perspective. It is a divine perspective. Here's the way you can live a life that has meaning and purpose and value. And that is to fear God and keep His commandments, knowing that there's going to be a judgment. In other words, for you and for me, we have two options when it comes to life. One is a life under the sun, where this world is all I've got, and man, I better make the most of it. I better make the most of all the opportunities I have. This is the YOLO mentality. You only live once. Make the most of it. Get what you can, get as quickly as you can, enjoy it as much as you can, because you're going to die. So eat, drink, and be merry. That's the best you can hope for. Or there's a better perspective. There's a better way to view life. There's a better way to perceive reality. And that is, there is a God. He has given us His commandments. and we're to walk with Him and obey His commandments, that you and I are to have a divine perspective rather than an under-the-sun perspective. And in many cases, Ecclesiastes kind of catches the spirit of the whole Bible. That people who live without thought of God live an empty, meaningless, purposeless existence. And they just try to get what they can in this life. Get the most property, get the most fame, get the most power, get the most money, get the most pleasure, whatever it is, that's their goal. He who dies with the most toys wins. The reality is he who dies, dies whether he's got toys or not. There's no winning to it. So don't live with that perspective. Instead, live with the perspective that God does exist. That God is all wise and all good and all holy and all righteous. And this God has told us how to live this life the best way. And so we don't live life with an under-the-sun perspective. We live it by following this book, which gives us the divine perspective, what God has said. And so I want to encourage you, don't live an empty life chasing vapors, chasing what looks to have meaning and purpose but doesn't. Don't live this life with an under-the-sun perspective, but instead fear God and keep His commandments, knowing that there is a final judgment that's coming, and that all those in Jesus Christ will survive that judgment because we've been forgiven by Him, and that we have lived this life not in vanity, but in value, because we lived it not with an under-the-sun perspective, but we've lived it with a God perspective. So I hope this will bring some encouragement to you, and that it will help you to think, hey, I need to take a divine perspective on things, not an under-the-sun perspective. I need one that counts. It counts not only in this life, but counts for all of eternity. So God bless you. I pray you have a great day and a great life with an above-the-sun perspective.